All right, we are live. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for a wonderful conversation with Dr. Sonya Lot. We're going to be talking about why it is so important that we move beyond the myth of the 5 stages of grief that we as a society are just so bombarded with. Like, this is what grief looks like. And as mental health professionals, it's important that we continue to learn about grief and how to support clients through grief and what to do when clients get stuck or when more happens after kind of the typical things we're used to seeing with grief. I don't want to give a lot away. So please ask your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. If there are questions, like clarifying questions, you're not sure what was just said, or you need a different way of explanation, I will interject with that so that we can address those questions sooner than later. And if there's other relevant questions that seem to be like, oh, I think we should ask this now, then I will do that as well. If you have anything that you would like to share more confidentially, you may do so by sending me a direct message. If you don't want the entire group to know your question or your comment, please let me know if you don't want me to share that with the whole group. If you would rather I send the question directly to Dr. Lott so that she can answer that privately. I understand that not everything, not everyone wants everything to be public. So I'm going to give you that space to ask your question in a way that feels best for you. All right, so thank you for being here. As I said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sonya Lot to everybody today. Please share with us a little bit about the work you do and how your career kind of took you to this place of grief work, and even the depths of what prolonged grief disorder, how you got into this place where you're at right now.
Yeah. So thank you, Robin. I just want to say good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening, depending on where you're coming in from, to everybody. And just want to express my gratitude for all of you being here. And then also note that I was saying to Robin yesterday that this topic is so relevant. I mean, it's right behind us just a couple days ago with the mass murders of the children and teachers in Texas. So I'm Dr. Sonya Lot. I've been a licensed psychologist for 30 years. And I'm located in Pennsylvania. I currently am in private practice. I've been back in private practice since 2015. I also own a continuing education company, specializing in helping us as therapists to do our work as it relates to multicultural competence. I'm trained in the diagnosis and treatment of prolonged grief disorder and evidence-based treatment. I'm also a certified brain spotting practitioner, and very recently, I'm a Reiki trained practitioner now. So I have a trauma foundation in addition to grief. So that's pretty much bio. The way that I got into grief work was to make a story not as long as it could be. I knew when I was 9 years old that I had to be a psychologist because I already was. I'd saved my little allowance and buy books on Freud. And I don't know what sense I made of it, but that, whatever. At the age of 21, when I went to graduate school, I got all I can call is a calling to do grief work. And I thought maybe the universe had misdirected that message, because I signed up for a death, dying, and bereavement course and cried the entire semester every time I opened the book. So some years later, as a full-time professor, I taught developmental psychology for 20 years. And I thought that emphasizing death, dying, and bereavement and helping students to move beyond their fear of dying and also their fear of living was the work that I was supposed to do. I had stopped doing clinical, in private practice. And then in 2015, April 15, 2015, my mom died. And so immediately I knew that I would come back. I had to come to back to clinical work to do this work after I had my time to, integrate such a profound loss. And I always say it was like a mandate. Well, my mom was I perceived her as very bossy, and she was here in the physical, and I pushed back from that. And so I feel like now she gets to boss me around in ways that I just have to say yes to because it serves my highest good. So it was really clear to me that at this point in my life, having experienced more loss, previous loss before mom, still with that one being the most profound, that I had lived long enough and done enough work where I was ready to say yes to this calling. And so I feel like prolonged grief, the training at Columbia University through the School of Social Work there found me, because I had just been back in practice a few months and was only working with people dealing with, quote, acute grief. And I stumbled on this training and it was profound. And I think it was 3 weeks later, the first person came to me who actually was dealing with prolonged grief disorder. So it's been on from there. I've just really immersed myself in, because there's so few of us in the that area and so much misunderstanding. It's like my mission is to work with as many people as possible who have this, quote, diagnosis, and to try to educate as many of us as therapists about what grief is and what it isn't. And that was supposed to be the not so long answer.
I think it was great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing. I find that it's so common for those of us in the field that we have profound experiences in our lives that lead us to the way that we show up in the field and within our communities and families as well. I was giggling picturing you as a 9-year-old reading Freud. I think that's so funny. I have a 9-year-old right now, and she is definitely not interested in Freud.
It's probably a good thing. It's probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's so cute. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. So you talked a little bit about how you kind of, brought into the picture that, there's a misunderstanding maybe about what grief is and what it isn't. There seem to be a lot of definitions of grief. How do you define grief? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, but I'm happy to take a try at it. I define grief as the physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual reaction to loss. And of course, meaning the loss of a significant other, but also non-death losses. Anytime we lose, let go of anything that we perceive to be of value, whether relationships, workplace, education, material things, a handbag, pair of shoes, whatever it might be, there's a dream, a way of believing that's loss, and it's grief is the reaction to that. We tend to have more profound reactions to the death of a loved one with whom we had a very close relationship with. So a lot of times grief is thought about just as the longing and the missing and the sadness, the longing for the person, if we're talking about death-related loss, and missing the person, wishing they were still here. There's so much more to that. Difficulty sleeping, headaches, difficulty making decisions. It looks, acute grief and prolonged grief looks a lot like depression. We tend to think in certain ways, what we call counterfactual thinking. If only I had done this, or maybe like in this case with the children, if I had it my baby had a bellyache. If I would just let him stay home today, he may still be alive. Or if, I could have been with my loved one, pandemic related, conditions, then maybe I would have noticed something and let the nurse know. Or it's that what if or only if thinking. Emotionally, we know there's a lot of sadness. There might be anger. There might be confusion. There might be guilt. And spiritually, there's actually a concept called complicated spiritual grief, where people are questioning, like, what type of God would allow this to happen to my child or to me or to my loved one? And so it's not uncommon to like really just rethink everything related to one's concept of God. It can also be where it brings us to a more profound understanding of something, a God, spirit, universe, something. So, it's really all encompassing when we're dealing with the death of a loved one with whom we had a close relationship. So everything's impacted.
Yeah, would you say some of these things apply as well, of like the loss of a relationship in terms of maybe divorce, or like, a friend breakup, those types of, do you notice those same things happening in those types of losses of relationship? Because they might seem permanent in one sense, right? Like you're not going to be in a relationship anymore, even though they haven't died. Do you notice those similar patterns?
In long-term relationships, there are a lot of similarities, because one of the reasons why we grieve so intensely when someone we're close to dies is because so much of who we are was in relationship or in like with integrated with who they were, and our loved ones that we're close to and that we trust help us to literally regulate our blood pressure, our autonomic nervous system, And so in relationships, romantic relationships, when those relationships end, we're losing a lot of the same things. If there were some really good things, in the relationship. But the difference is with the death of a loved one, it's irreversible. There's always a chance, even if you don't want it, if you're in a relationship when you break up, that person's still living, there might always be a chance you all can reconcile, but when a loved one dies, that's just it. There's nothing, but the constant reminders of when they were here.
Yeah, thank you for that added clarity on that.
I see some questions around counterfactual thinking, but I just saw that pop up. Can you?
Yeah, do folks need clarification on what counterfactual thinking or reasoning is, or some examples, or did you just need clarification on the term counterfactual? Yes, please. Okay, so can you please provide a little bit more explanation or examples of what counterfactual thinking or reasoning is?
Yeah, it's one of the it's referred to as a derailer in the process of grief that gets people stuck. It's the way of thinking, the imaginary scenarios, if you will, the what ifs, and it's not unique to grief. It's a type of thinking, the what ifs. I mean, like in relationship, if only I wouldn't have said yes to that person when they invited me to go on this retreat, I wouldn't have gotten to know them and ended up having an affair and lost my relationship. It's the what ifs that we get stuck in. And that's just the concept of a form of thinking where we're imagining alternative outcomes. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. Folks, let us know if you need a little bit more explanation.
Very
Happy
welcome.
to spend another. Yeah. I noticed that coming in for myself a lot in I think when a lot of us, when we experience a loss and we know, okay, another one could come at any moment, I
Mhm.
find myself sometimes thinking, all right, this could happen or that could happen. So what if I don't do this? Or what if I do this instead, right? Get into this like pre-planning
Mhm. That,
place too.
yeah,
Uh,
that's the hypervigilance or the
yeah.
hypersensitivity to loss, especially after we have experienced it. We become more sensitive to all the other people in our life, including, and I should say, our furry ones too. Our
Yes.
pets, if they are going to leave us in the
Yeah.
same way. Yeah, yeah. I can remember after my dad died in 1992, very suddenly at age 59, younger than I am now, actually. I had been married just some months, and I started waking up during the night and literally putting my hand on my husband's chest to make sure he was still breathing. And it's the way that I discovered he had sleep apnea, because he would stop breathing. And it scared me. And I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is sleep apnea. He had some other things, but just that hypersensitivity, because if my dad, who I love so deeply, can leave, then my husband, who I love so deeply, can die too. And it's not, it defies logic. It's the emotion, it's the heart, you know. Yeah, so that's
Yeah,
really true. I'm,
exactly.
I'm going to talk about counter. Let me just say, I know everybody, I'm assuming that everybody here isn't yet registered for the Be Bold Summit, which is next Friday and Saturday online. If you want to, there's still time to sign up.
Hmm.
Okay. And I'm presenting Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time. I'm going to talk a lot more about counterfactual thinking. So I
Hmm.
just want to let folks know that.
Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. All right. So how is acute grief different from prolonged grief? You've kind of said both terms. What is the difference between the two, and how do we know if a client or ourselves, like we're trending more toward prolonged grief? What are the differences?
The primary difference, and I want to be very delicate about this, because the people who still cling to the 5 stages of grief, which of course I got to talk to why importance of moving past that. Someone just, okay, you're attending to that. I'm sorry. Let me stop paying attention. Can I, okay, I wanted to try to, like, I'm being distracted by it. I'm sorry. And I lost my thought. I'm sorry, because I was looking at the chat.
That's okay.
What was I about to say? You asked me a question.
What's the difference between acute and
Thank you.
prolonged
Okay,
grief?
got it. All right. So time is one piece, and I want to be really clear about this. We don't consider the diagnosis for prolonged grief disorder until at least 12 months, according to the DSM-5 TR, which I call, DSM whatever, oops. But 6 months for children and adolescents, which is developmentally appropriate, and at least 12 months for adults. Now, what's behind that? That in and of itself is not sufficient. Because people are going to grieve for the rest of their lives, okay? Not necessarily suffer, but we're never going to stop missing. And I'm talking now just about death-related grief. We're never going to stop missing the person. We're never going to stop wishing they were here. But what we assumed, based on what we know about humans, is that we all have an innate capacity to rebound from the most profound traumatic experiences in our life with the right supports after the trauma. And the death of a loved one is almost always traumatic. Even if they die peacefully and it's expected, the attachment trauma is always there. And so, with the assumption that we all have the innate capacity to deal with any type of profound trauma with the right supports in place, we expect that a year out, that the very acute, what we see very acutely, the profound breakdown should be, the person should be in a different place, should be at a point where they're not suffering as much, where they're able to integrate a new way of living now without that person, though that loss is still in their core, central to their living. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's specific symptoms that must be present almost every day, if not every day, for at least 30 days past the 1-year mark. And it's to the degree that it interferes with their day-to-day functioning in the workplace and or in relationships. So we're talking about people who all day long are thinking about the loved one, and they're ruminating about, what if I could have done this, or I should have done that, or this shouldn't have happened this way, or if I had known that. They're putting a lot of energy into constantly trying to avoid reminders of the person. They're still not able to look at photographs or talk about the person or hear other people talk about them. They are likely very tearful and or feeling very numb. They're having difficulty concentrating. It's all the things that happen at the beginning. And so the assumption with prolonged grief disorder is not that there's something wrong with the person. If you are trauma informed, we're encouraged to take the perspective of what has happened to you. Let's work from that place rather than what's wrong with you. So it's in understanding the types of things that have happened, and then now realizing that a year out, the person is still suffering to this extent. So they may not be able to work, or they're not able to concentrate, well, whatever it might be. And so it's like at that time to appropriately intervene and offer them a pretty transformational form of therapy. So the difference is just that people are stuck. They get stuck. They get derailed, if you will, somewhere along the way. And I'm going to talk in the presentation about the impact of the pandemic, just filled with some of those risk factors that increase the likelihood that we end up in prolonged grief, and some of the derailers that once we're in a grief, we're likely to get stuck. So hopefully that's clear. It's really the same. It's just that it's unremitted a year later. And a lot of times those people get diagnosed as depressed. There might be a coexisting depression also, but the treatments for depression like CBT and the SSRIs and all that don't work for grief.
Yeah.
So you have to, quote, treat both, but you have to see that both are existing. And another thing I'm going to talk about again in the presentation next Friday, I'm going to talk about some of the differences and the overlap or the coexistence of PTSD, grief, and depression. Because again, as a result of the pandemic, more of us are experiencing what somebody just asked about, traumatic grief. And can I just say something about traumatic grief?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's a concept that's used sort of unofficially or informally to refer to the traumatic aspect of grief, and particularly if the manner of death is traumatic, if it's homicide, suicide, then we talk about it as, quote, traumatic grief. But again, grief in and of itself is traumatic because we don't grieve long-term unless we had a really close relationship with the person. For people we didn't have a good relationship with, it may take us a little time to get over the guilt of being relieved that they're gone, but it's the people that we're most connected with. And so it's the trauma of the break in the attachment, the permanent break in the attachment. So hopefully that answers that question about traumatic grief.
Yeah, and we had kind of a similar, well, I don't know if it's similar, but we also had a question about can you talk about the connection between prolonged grief and domestic violence and or complex trauma? I know those are very broad things, but from your experience, what do you know about that?
So there are a host of risk factors that increase the likelihood that we may end up in prolonged getting stuck in our grief process if we experience the death of a loved one. And so they can be, a history of depression, a history of conflictual relationships. So domestic violence isn't, or intimate partner abuse isn't mentioned specifically, but it would be included in, trauma, previous trauma of any kind, or previous losses of relationships, deaths of loved ones. It can also be if the person has experienced financial losses, having to relocate. This happens a lot with spouses when one dies, having to relocate, losing that person's income. So there are a lot of risk factors. So people who have had PTSD or complex trauma in their lives are going to be more vulnerable to the challenge of moving through grief. Yeah. So I hope that answers. And I want to talk about, because I'm aware of the time, and I appreciate all the questions, and I'm so grateful all of you are here. But I want to talk about why we must move past the 5 stages of grief idea.
Yes, please.
And so the short answer is because as a result of the pandemic, more people are experiencing grief, profound grief on so many levels, death and non-death related losses, that we must understand what grief is and what it isn't and be able to appropriately intervene. And if we can know what prolonged grief looks like, we can interact with people at the onset of grief in a way to help to prevent some of that in a proactive way. And so the myth of the 5 stages is woven into the fabric of our society. And most people know that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was like this amazing psychiatrist who offered us so much around understanding the needs of the dying and palliative care, hospice, near-death experiences, interviewed around 16 people who were dying and proposed from that, those case studies, if you will, that there might be some stages. She actually said more than 5 stages that people go through when they have been given a terminal diagnosis before they die. She then later said, well, I wonder if these stages may apply to people who are grieving. David Kessler, who's still living, met Elizabeth Kubler-Ross toward the end of her life, after she had some strokes, developed a mentor-mentee relationship with her, and she invited him to co-author 2 books. The second one was on grief and grieving. The manuscript was finished, I think, a month before she died. The book was published, and so he's been, that's his claim to fame, if you will. He's not a mental health professional, has no training in grief, no official training. He ignores the research. And so because of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, she was so revered, and she offered so much, people connect those quote 5 stages with her, and now David Kessler, who is a very charismatic person, and I believe has a real ability to be present with people when they're experiencing acute grief. And that's a really important component. I want to acknowledge that. And so I just heard it the other day on the news. One of the officials in Texas was saying that, the 5 stages, he knew that most people were in denial now. And I just wanted to scream. I just wanted to go through the television. But what's the problem with the 5 stages of grief? Well, there aren't any stages of grief. That's the first thing. In mental health and psychology, we don't even talk about development, if you will, from a stage-wide progression anymore. David Kessler says, well, Elizabeth and I never meant that they were linear, you might circle through, but it's more than that. The actual grief researchers and experts in the field, there's an article, Stroop and Schut, who are in the Netherlands, who have offered what's called the dual processing theory of grief. There's a really, really good article that I share with people. Caution for mental health professionals, we're being misled by this theory. It's too simplistic. Grief doesn't happen in stages. The concepts are poorly defined. Depression is one. We need to really be careful and distinguish depression from acute grief and prolonged grief. It's oversimplistic. The research has refuted it repeatedly. And so when theories, anybody can offer theory, and it needs to be written in a way or offered in a way that it can be put to the scientific test with full awareness of the limitations of research and quote, evidence-based, whatever. I get it. But when a theory is repeatedly refuted, what we typically do is leave that theory, letting it have put it on the shelf and move forward with more plausible theories. There are many more plausible theories available to us around grief, but it's almost cult-like, the popularity and the belief that if David Kessler or Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said this, it's true. So many therapists will staunchly defend both he and her around in their quote training. Somebody's asking if I could share the article. I can, I'll do it at the end. Thank you for asking, Sally. So what ends up happening is that people believe, and here's the other thing, it doesn't give us as therapists any template map of how to work with people. I can remember David said in a training, somebody asked, how do you know what stage someone's in? And he said, oh, it doesn't matter what stage you're in, just be present with them. Well, okay, So it just doesn't give us anything we need. And so here's the other thing. Because there's this piece that grief is normal, which it absolutely is, that if you try to do anything other than just be present with them, that you're pathologizing their grief. And again, I'm saying if you understand that they're like Bill Warden's tasks, there are 4 tasks he talks about. Therese Randall talks about the 6 R's, the phases, if you will, of grief. Catherine Shearer talks about the healing milestones. We have so many other plausible theories of how to understand grief. And from there, very specific types of treatments, if you will, or ways to support treatments, including like the creative arts, dance, and journaling, and not just quote psychotherapy. All the somatic things to help people to get grief out of their bodies. So it prevents us from doing the work we need to do to help people to heal. And so for me, because I specialize in prolonged grief disorder, by the time people get to me, sometimes a decade later, often it's somewhere between, 18 months, 3 years, somewhere in there. And they tell me the things that therapists have told them based on this belief of 5 stages of grief. And another one of the derailers for prolonged grief disorder is believing that your grief should look a certain way. And so people tell me all the time, well, I feel like I should be I should be angry and I'm not, or I should be in acceptance and, I'm really depressed, just all kind of crazy stuff. And so there's this whole idea too, in addition to the quote 5 stages, that we don't have to be mental health professionals to understand grief, that our lived experience is sufficient, that we have expertise. That's a part of it. And we talk about that, the components of death confidence is referred to. But grief is unique to every person. And just because we survived it doesn't mean that we're an expert. in it, and just because something is normal, that there's nothing we need to know. And I'm going to say this in like pause, but I always talk about it like in relation to adolescence. Like parents think that if everybody survives, nobody goes to jail, their kids graduate high school, and they're fully functioning adults, if you will, that they're experts in adolescence because everybody survived. And that's not true. Each child is unique. And there's a lot of craziness that normally happens in adolescence that we don't have to worry about, but we need to understand what's quote normal and what isn't, because some of those normal behaviors can become very problematic. Like experimental drug use, for example, normal. What are the signs that the child is moving into abuse? Or what are the risk factors that may make them more vulnerable to that? So it's the same thing with grief. We need to be grounded in the theory and research, and there's so much out there. But we have to get past this myth of the 5 stages and the charisma of, I think, David Kessler. Okay, pause.
Yeah, thank you. I'm listening to you and reflecting on my own experiences. I lost my father died 2 years after yours, almost to the day after your mom. But and I remember thinking I already knew, I already had a feeling these 5 stages, they're not legit, like no way. And then this happened, and like absolutely didn't find them at all in my process, so hearing you talk about it from this way is very affirming. I think a lot of folks might feel. Also, I think it is interesting. This is just a curiosity, that it makes a little bit of sense why we want to hold on to the idea of the 5 stages of grief, because it contains it makes it seem easier to navigate and more simple. And our society, we don't make a lot of space for grief and to move through grief and to feel. I think in general in our society, feeling is not prioritized.
That's right. Yeah, we can't handle it's too much.
Yeah, it's too much. Yeah. And so, I understand kind of from this like collective level, like why we hold on to it, even though I think so many of us believe that it is not the case. It is not what's happening. It's not what we experience. And yet it's easy to hold on to because maybe, just maybe, grief will be that easy for us. And it's just not. I thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you're going to share so much more at the summit. And ongoing in your continued work in the community. So, yeah.
So if I can just say that I always get, it's difficult to speak truth to quote power. And let me say, David Kessler is not alone in this. I name him because of his work. He's the one who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, brought the theory forward, and is, really, he's a big part of perpetuating the myth, but he isn't the only person. And also, I know as therapists, we're all showing up and doing the best that we can, right? And so I don't want to, not my intention, I recognize the difference between intention and impact. It's not to shame any therapist for showing up and doing the best work. I understand why so many people still believe it. As I said, it's woven into the fabric of our society.
Yes.
But, when we learn something new, we can make a new choice. And so for anybody here who has believed and may still be believing that the 5 stages of grief work for me, that it's really, blah, 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 or whatever it might be, if you just have an opening, just read this article, for example. Strove and Shoot, there's somebody else whose name, it's a third author whose name is escaping me in the moment, are the most well-respected and at the forefront of the research of what grief is, quote, acute grief. And they mention all the other plausible theories. It's a great starting point. It's a great starting point. So my intention is to help people to see what's really true with the idea that we're all in this profession to try to offer the highest level of healing to the people who we're sitting with.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's important to note. And because we are all trained in different ways, and
Right.
sometimes we don't know, we don't know what we don't know until we know
Right.
it.
Right.
And
Right.
and I believe that we still do beautiful work, even, you know, in times where we may have information that is not, that we come to find like it is not actually how it is for most people or any
Mhm.
people. So
Mhm.
thank
Mhm.
you.
Mhm.
I know folks might have additional questions. So as I'm closing us out, feel free to, if you have a one last question, put that in the chat. And if we can answer it real quick, we will. If not, we can, you know, maybe send an email or something. But
I
were you
just
gonna
have
say something?
Yeah, please, I just have a question. Somebody
Yeah.
asked for the article. Is it
Uh-huh.
possible to send that in the email with the recording?
Yes, yes. You can
Okay,
just send me the link and I will put it in the email with the recording that will go out later today. And we'll send you a few emails over the next few days.
Mhm.
So with that, thank you so much for being here. Any of you who want to learn more from Dr. Lott and from our other speakers at the Be Bold Summit, you can definitely register. It is June 10th and 11th. And for the next 3 days, we have a special offer as a thank you for joining us today. You can receive 20% off your registration until Monday, the 30th at 8 p.m. Pacific time. I will put that link in the chat, and you'll also get a couple of email reminders over the next 3 days in case you want to think about it and sign up. So there's a special registration link for this discount that I will share with you. And let me put that link in the chat right now. I'm really not good at talking and typing at the same time. So here is the link. And then just put a save 20% through Monday, May 30th at 8 p.m. Pacific time. By registering on that link. I will send you all an email later this evening with the replay information and the link to the article that was discussed today. If you have any follow-up questions, we will hope to answer them at the summit. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful, yes.
Can I just, will you please include my contact info? Where folks can find me? People are asking more questions
Yes.
that I'd like to answer.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Thank you, everybody.
For that.
And
Thank
you,
you,
Robin.
everybody. Yes. Thank you.